music, whiskey in hand, there's one aspect of the psychological jeopardy that is almost entirely absent: suicide. Nowhere in popular fiction, in the movies, or in any of the multitude of streaming services does the suicide of a police officer feature. A taboo that's only gradually been addressed in the wider public conversation is entirely absent in the representation of policing. It would be easy to imagine that this is simply a consequence of producers and publishers not want to present our heroes as anything other than superheroes. That may well be true, but it does do a disservice to those we call upon when faced with what will probably be one of the worst days of our lives. Thinking logically, the pressures and experiences the police face day in, day out must have a deep impact on officers. As the taboo of suicide is gradually being faced up to in wider society, how is it being addressed within UK policing? To what extent is suicide among the policing family understood and monitored, and what efforts could be made to tackle it? In this week's episode of A Perspective on Crime, we're looking at a new piece of research named Lives on the Line of Duty: Preventing Suicide Among Police Officers and Staff. The paper is authored by Leeming and Marina Hasan of Leeds Trinity University and is in the International Journal of Criminology and Penal Education. The methodology adopted by the authors is revealing of the challenges in the field. They choose secondary data analysis, synthesising existing academic studies, official statistics and professional reports rather than conducting primary interviews. To explain, the term secondary data essentially means using information that's already been collated by others, be it the Office of National Statistics or internal police records, to identify new patterns and insights. Why, you might ask, would researchers not go straight to the source and talk to those affected? The authors made this decision because of the ethical barriers inherent in studying suicide. When the primary subject of the study is no longer with us, researchers can't elicit their subjective accounts. They can't ask about their final thoughts, the proximity of triggers, or the shield that failed to protect them. This creates a hurdle for causal inference, the academic term for trying to prove that factor A directly led to result B. Also, to reach out to bereaved families or colleagues who are still grieving carries a significant risk of re-traumatisation. There's also the further risk of recall bias, where the immense pain of the present might unintentionally colour the facts of the past, leading survivors to search for meaning that may or may not have been there at the time. Psychological autopsy studies, where researchers attempt to reconstruct the deceased state of mind through records and interviews, are rare and somewhat problematic. Thankfully, wider society today has a nuanced understanding of suicide, that no single issue is its cause. The complexity of an individual's inner life is almost impossible to know, understand, and weigh with appropriate significance. By looking at the broader data landscape, Leeming and Hasan have attempted to map what they describe as a fragmented picture of risk that currently exists, providing a more objective, if paradoxically more distant, vantage point. As the authors highlight, this map is currently obscured by what they term a systematic undercounting. If we look at the official data from the Office of National Statistics, we see a figure that might appear comparable to the general population. Roughly 10 to 14 suicides per 100,000 serving police officers in the UK. Leeming and Hasan, however, invite us to look at the numbers closely. They point out a significant gap between the official figures and the data obtained through freedom of information requests by organisations like the Police Federation. For instance, between 2011 and 2019, the College of Policing identified 163 deaths by suicide or undetermined intent. The Police Federation, however, estimated around 242 suicides took place among police officers and police community support officers between 2011 and 2022. For overseas listeners, it's probably worth taking a moment to explain what a PCSO is. Within the police family here in the UK, a PCSO is a police community support officer. They're a uniformed member of police staff who works in the community to support crime prevention, community safety and local policing initiatives. With blue flashes, the only visible differentiation in uniform, they serve without holding the powers of a full warranted police officer. So, back to the question of numbers. If we can't accurately count the number of officers we're losing, we can't begin to evaluate what interventions are working. The official registers often suffer from occupational coding errors. A death certificate might record a person's hobby or a previous job, rather than mentioning they were a serving officer or a member of police staff. Furthermore, the work encourages us to consider coronial practices. When an officer dies in ambiguous circumstances, a coroner may return an open verdict if intent to die can't be proved beyond a reasonable doubt. These deaths often vanish from official suicide statistics, hidden in the undeterminate intent category. Sometimes done out of a sense of compassion for the family or to protect the reputation of the deceased, from a public health perspective, it masks the true scale of the crisis. Most poignantly, the research points out that between January 2022 and May 2025, there were 34 deaths by suicide among former police staff. It suggests a cliff edge of retirement, where the loss of the professional identity and the sudden absence of the police family can leave former officers profoundly vulnerable. For senior officers, this data is an alarm bell. It suggests that their responsibility to their staff doesn't end when they leave the service. It's clear then that without a national mandated dataset, forces are essentially flying blind, unable to target support to specific units or demographics, such staff and volunteers who are often excluded from these counts entirely, where the need is most desperate. Behind just the cold numbers, though, lies a complex web of human suffering, which the researchers categorise into two distinct types of pressure: occupational and organisational stressors. For criminologists, distinguishing between these two is essential. Occupational stressors are the risks inherent with the job itself, the things that happen out on the street or in the station. These are the repeated exposures to sudden deaths, violent crime scenes and harrowing child protection issues. And these are not isolated events. They have a cumulative trauma. Consider the officer who spends years investigating digital evidence of child abuse. They aren't on the front line in a physical sense, but they're experiencing what's described as vicarious trauma, a psychological erosion that comes from being a constant witness to the victims of others, to the victimisation of others. The authors also use the term moral injury to describe a specific and profound type of psychological pain. Imagine an officer who spent 2 decades priding themselves on their professional ethics, on their ability to protect the vulnerable. Now, imagine that due to systemic delays or a split-second decision made under impossible pressure, they feel they have failed a victim. Even if they followed every procedure to the letter, the collision between their professional identity and the reality of the outcomes creates a sense of guilt and shame that is different from PTSD. It's a wound into the sense of self, a moral injury that can lead to a deep sense of perceived failure. As Leeming and Hasan note, these experiences are not rare. They're a routine part of modern policing landscapes, where officers are frequently asked to resolve the unresolvable. A striking evaluation made by Leeming and Hasan is that organisational stresses, the pressures from the office rather from the street, can be just as harmful, if not more so, than traumatic operational events. This is a vital point they ask us to reflect upon. We often assume that it's the blood and bones of policing that breaks people, but the research suggests it's often the bureaucracy and the internal culture that serve as the final catalyst for an acute crisis. Think of the chronic understaffing that's characterised almost 2 decades of UK policing. Austerity saw budgets slashed while demand continued to rise. This leads to unmanageable workloads, case backlogs, and a sense of institutional injustice when officers feel they've been set up to fail by their own organisation. The researchers also ask us to consider the physiological toll of shift work. Policing depends on irregular, rotating rosters that fundamentally disrupt circadian rhythms, the body's natural internal clock. When an officer is constantly moving between days and nights, their sleep is sacrificed. Medical science tells us that sleep deprivation impairs emotional regulation and cognitive functioning, creating a fertile ground for depression and anxiety. Combining chronic fatigue with the high-stakes environment of personal risk and public scrutiny creates a pressure cooker. To provide some context from the wider justice system, the sources draw a compelling comparison with the prison and probation service. In a recent report, it was noted that nearly 150,000 working days were lost to mental ill health in this sector in the last year, a 44% rise since 2019. It's clear that this is a systemic crisis across our public services. Whether it's a prison officer facing violence on the landing or a police officer facing a backlog of digital evidence, the organisational weight is becoming unbearable. This brings us to what the authors call the mask of resilience that defines much of policing culture. In an environment that valorises stoicism and emotional toughness, admitting to a struggle can feel like an admission of professional failure. This is often described as a macho ethos, a culture where officers feel they must remain bulletproof, not just physically, but emotionally. This culture stops people from seeking help early, leading them to hide their distress until it reaches a breaking point. This performative strength masks a deepening vulnerability and is further compounded by the fear of a disciplinary investigation. Leeming and Hasan highlight that officers under investigation often report extreme anxiety and a sense of total isolation. In an era of body-worn cameras and extensive digital oversight, every move is scrutinised. And while accountability is vital for public trust, the authors suggest that when the management style is perceived as punitive rather than supportive, the internal culture itself becomes a risk factor. As they observe, the way an organisation treats its staff during their most vulnerable moments, when they've made a mistake or are struggling to cope, can have as much of a psychological impact as the trauma of operational events they face on duty. For the authors, it's a moral choice. Does the organisation view its officers as a disposable asset or as human beings? The recognition that the current system is under strain leads us to the critical reflection on the interventions currently available in the UK. There's TRIM, or Trauma Risk Management. Originally developed within the military, TRIM is a peer-led support system where trained colleagues, not clinicians, offer structured support following a critical incident. The idea is to normalise the act of talking about trauma and to identify those who might need professional intervention before they reach a crisis. While TRIM has been praised for reducing the stigma around mental health, its provision across 43 forces in England and Wales is notoriously uneven, the research says. Furthermore, peer supporters often lack the formal supervision and clear role boundaries required for such sensitive work. There's also programmes like the Blue Light Programme or Blue Light Wellbeing Framework, established in 2020. These have made significant strides in raising awareness and training thousands of champions. The question is, though, Do these programs actually reduce suicide rates? The limitation of many current interventions is that they focus heavily on individual resilience, essentially teaching the officer how to cope better with an impossible situation. The psychological equivalent of giving someone an umbrella in a hurricane and telling them that it's their fault if they get wet. As Leeming and Hasan argue, individual coping skills, where valuable, rarely provide lasting protection if the organisational conditions, the workload, the shifts, the punitive culture remain unchanged. Looking abroad for international best practice, the examples cited are illuminating and, frankly, quite hopeful. The researchers point to the Together for Life programme in Quebec and Canada. This isn't just a simple helpline or a one-off training session. It's a multi-layered, coordinated strategy that involves everyone from senior leadership to the families of officers. It includes a 24-hour crisis lane, mandatory training for all ranks, consistent debriefing protocols, and critically, a coordinated and considered surge in support around staff who have lost a colleague to suicide. Together for Life represents a fundamental shift in the moral compass of the organisation, moving away from a culture of blame to one of collective responsibility. Over a 12-year period, the programme saw a 79% reduction in police suicides. The report concludes that leadership is a crucial role in this space. The authors cite the Stevenson and Farmer Review, which emphasised that for cultural change to be effective, it must be led from the very top. Senior leaders must do more than just endorse mental health transparency, they must model it. When a chief constable or senior officer speaks openly about their own struggles or the importance of seeking help, the macho ethos begins to lose its grip. This is why senior level buy-in is so important, the authors say. Without it, any well-meaning intervention remains a peripheral activity, a tick-box exercise, rather than a core organisational value. Normalise help-seeking so that it's viewed as a sign of professional responsibility rather than a career-ending weakness. Enshrine and demonstrate suicide prevention in policing as a public policy priority that demands compassion and proactive attention. Leeming and Hasan are clear in the recommendations, and they provide a roadmap for change. First and foremost, we need a national database of police suicide records. We need a system that captures precise information, not just the fact of death, but the age, rank, ethnicity, and the situational factors leading to it. This would allow, they say, for subgroup analysis. For example, the data shows that men account for 74% of suicides nationally. Within policing, it's often those in their 30s and 40s, those at the height of their operational exposure and burden with increasing domestic responsibilities, who are at a greater risk. By identifying similar patterns, forces can move from a one-size-fits-all approach to a targeted, demographic-specific intervention. There's also a desperate need for trauma-informed disciplinary processes. If an officer is under investigation, the process should be handled with an acute awareness of the psychological strain involved. This might mean pausing proceedings after a major traumatic event to allow for recovery, or ensuring that the officer has access to independent, confidential clinical services that aren't linked to the force's own occupational health department. Many officers distrust force-linked services, fearing that what they might say in a therapy session will find its way back to their personnel files. External commissioning of support, as recommended by organisations like Oscar Kilo, is a vital step in building that trust. Ultimately, the synthesis of this research leads to one inescapable conclusion. Sustainable progress requires systematic cultural change. Constabularies must move away from the idea that mental health is solely the responsibility of an individual officer to stay resilient. Instead, the organisation must take responsibility for the conditions it creates. It must evaluate workload demands with the same rigour it applies to street crime statistics. A shift from individual blame to organisational accountability is vital for the future of the police workforce. Genuine acknowledgement must be given that officers and staff are the most important asset the service has, fostering a culture where conversations about mental health and preventable loss aren't just encouraged, but are a standard part of the professional life. What we often call the thin blue line protects the public, but that line is made of people, fathers, mothers, sons and daughters, who deserve a system that protects them in return. They're the individuals who deal with the most harrowing aspects of our society, so the rest of us don't have to. The work of Leeming and Marina Hasan provides a rigorous, evidence-based roadmap for change and moves from a fragmented, incomplete picture of risk towards a future of compassionate, proactive action. It reminds us that while the uniform may be a symbol of authority, the person wearing it is human, and that their life is worth more investment of our time, our resources, and our moral authority. The research that has guided our discussions is a paper called Lives on the Line of Duty, Preventing Suicide Among Police Officers and Staff. It's authored by Leeming and Marina Hasan and is published in the International Journal of Criminology and Penal Education. A link to the paper, as ever, is in the show notes, and of course, I would urge you to read it for yourself. New episodes of A Perspective on Crime will drop every week, so make sure you subscribe and please recommend A Perspective on Crime to friends, colleagues, or anyone who you think might be interested. Finally, if you've read some research you think others should know about, drop me a message via the link in the show notes. If you yourself have new work coming out and like it covered, please get in touch. Until next time, goodbye.